Joining us now is Dr. Lawrence Lessig, Larry Lessig, professor of law at Harvard Law School. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I've heard every interview that you've done with Cenk Uygur, and it's crazy that this is the first time that I'm speaking to you one-on-one, but it's really a
I'm
pleasure.
kind of hurt. It's taken so long.
I know, right? So you do such great work when it comes to getting money out of politics. But before we get to that portion of the interview, I actually wanted to talk to you a little bit about the work that you've been doing with Equal Citizens, specifically in representing plaintiffs when it comes to the Electoral College and what electors are expected to do when it comes to casting their vote in the presidential election. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, so what we think is that something's got to happen to move the status quo on the Electoral College. You know, every 4 years we come close to a disaster or we have a disaster and then people forget about it. And so what we've been thinking about since the last disaster is what do we do to push reform to get it so that we get an electoral college or we get a system for selecting the president that people could be confident in. And the first thing we thought it was important to clarify is whether electors are actually bound to vote the way in which their state tells them to vote. Now, most people think the answer to that question is yes, and most people think that electors will do what their state tells them to do. But the reality is, I think as the Supreme Court will confirm when we get to the court, which on Friday we'll discover whether we're going to go to the court. In fact, the framers gave us a system where the electors are free to do whatever they want. And so that reality alone should give people a significant interest or motivation for finding a way to fix this antiquated institution that may have made sense 225 years ago, but I think most people would be anxious about today.
Right, exactly, because I believe conventional wisdom is that the electors are going to follow suit with what the constituents want, what individuals in that state voted for, but that's not necessarily the case, and there are conflicting rulings coming from Colorado and Washington State. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Right, so we've been representing electors in both Colorado and in Washington who in 2016 voted their conscience and then were punished or threatened to be punished for their actions. So in Colorado, an elector was kicked off as an elector and 2 others were threatened. And in Washington, the electors were fined $1,000 for voting contrary to their pledge. Now, in all of these cases, our clients were people who believed, in fact, they were acting exactly as the people who voted for them would have wanted them to act, because they were trying to create a condition where the Electoral College decision would have shifted the choice for president into the House, giving people an opportunity to vote for somebody other than Donald Trump, maybe a middle candidate like Kasich or something like that. So they thought they were doing something that was in the right for the purpose of resolving that election. But whether they thought that or not, the view of the state was that they were not allowed to act contrary to their pledge. So in Washington State, the Supreme Court, a year ago, we made the arguments in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court of Washington said, yes, in fact, the electors can be compelled to vote as the state wants them to do. But in the 10th Circuit in Colorado, the court wrote, Judge McHugh wrote about a 140-page opinion explaining why it's absolutely clear that the framers intended these electors to be constitutionally free. So that creates the split, which is the urgent need for the Supreme Court to resolve the question. And once the court resolves the question, then it's on us to decide whether the system that was given to us by the 12th Amendment 200 years ago is a system we want to continue with today.
What is the ideal outcome for you? Do you believe that doing away with the Electoral College and relying on the popular vote is the best way to go about presidential elections?
Look, in my philosopher's dream hat, yeah, absolutely. I think national popular vote is exactly the right way to go. But in my practical, we live in a country with lots of different people hat, I actually think there's a middle position that is much more likely to be adopted as a constitutional amendment and would give national popular vote people like me 95% of what we want. And what that position says is that you should divide the electors in each state proportionally at a fractional level dividing it between the top two candidates in that state. So for example, if the Democrat got 35% in Montana, the Democrat would get 1.067 electors in Montana. Or if they got 50% or 45% in California, they would get half of 45% of the electors in California, but precisely down to whatever significant digit that was. Now, the reason that's such an important victory is that it would make every state in America count in the ultimate decision for the president. Right now, the only states that candidates care about are the so-called swing states. So if you live in California, you don't matter to the presidential candidates, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. If you live in Texas, you don't matter. If you live in New York, you don't matter. The only states that matter are the swing states. So 14 states in 2016 got 95% of campaign visits and 99% of campaign spending. Now, the problem with that is that those 14 states don't represent America. They are older, they're whiter, their industry is kind of late 19th century industry. So if the president of the United States is trying to win those people, he or she is not trying to win America. So we need a system where the presidential campaign cares about winning votes from every part of this country. National popular vote would get us that, but to get national popular vote with a constitutional amendment would require 38 states to adopt it, which is not likely. But the view that I think we should recognize, the position I'm trying to push, is if we allocated proportionally at a fractional level, that would be almost as good, practically as good as national popular vote. And it would bring every American into the project of electing a president, make everybody count equally.
Yeah. Well, you say that states like California don't matter to presidential candidates, and you're right when it comes to the Electoral College. But when it comes to campaign fundraising, you see pretty much every single candidate show up to Beverly Hills and raise money by bundlers and different campaign events. So let's talk a little bit about money in politics. That's one of the issues that you've been a real fighter against. And there's been this narrative, and it's been part of my thought process when it comes to the Democratic establishment regarding their weakness at the face of, Republican aggression, especially during the Trump era. Donald Trump seems to accomplish some of his legislative goals, and it's mind-boggling to me to see people like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer help him in accomplishing those goals. And I've always thought, well, Democrats are weak, they're not good at messaging. But I've come to just realize that a lot of members of the Democratic Party are funded by the same actors that you see funding Republican campaigns. And so if they're funded by the same people, it's likely they're influenced by the same people, and they're essentially going to work together to accomplish the same legislative goals. And so you have Nancy Pelosi helping Donald Trump when it comes to, the tax cuts, when it comes to repealing some of the taxes that were implemented on the private health insurance companies as part of the Affordable Care Act. She has helped Donald Trump in increasing the military budget. The same day that Donald Trump was, they announced the articles of impeachment against him, less than an hour later, Nancy Pelosi held a press conference and announced that she was working on negotiating with Trump on his signature trade deal in North America. So I kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit about just how influential that money is. Is it really a weakness problem with Democrats, or am I right in feeling like the money is really influencing some of the actions behind the scenes?
Yeah, well, look, this is a complicated question. The first point is, we shouldn't pretend that there's any equivalence between the Republicans and Democrats here. But we shouldn't pretend that either side is innocent either. They both are dependent on basically the same people. Like, members of Congress and candidates for Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money essentially from the same 150,000 people. These are the people who fund in a large enough way to make them worth the time of a member as the members dialing for dollars to raise the money they need to get elected. And the only way that changes is if we fundamentally change the way we fund campaigns. Now, 2020, this election cycle, has been extraordinarily exciting on that fight because we have seen real innovation in talking about how we can fund campaigns publicly. I think Andrew Yang was the first out of the box to say he would give every citizen 100 democracy dollars, democracy vouchers basically, that they could use to help fund campaigns. Because what he knew is if you do that, then candidates would stop spending so much time talking to the pharmaceutical company representatives or the petroleum or the carbon monopoly people to raise their money. And instead they would start talking to ordinary people to raise their money. And they would be dependent on us. So Andrew Yang did that. Kirsten Gillibrand, when she was in the race, upped it. She was talking about up to $600. But the most exciting thing for me was to be on stage just about a week and a half ago in New Hampshire with Bernie Sanders and Zephyr Teachout. And Bernie Sanders came out forcefully talking about the importance of giving every single voter these democracy vouchers so that they would, right from the very beginning of a campaign, be focused on who they should be supporting because they knew they had money to give to those candidates. And even more importantly, those candidates would be focused on ordinary voters rather than thinking about what the millionaires or the billionaires or the people who give large contributions care about. That would be a revolutionary change in how politics works. And it is the most important reform that candidates could be talking about. So it's great that basically everyone, it's not clear where Biden is yet, but every one of the major candidates is talking about fundamental reform. And at least 7 of them are talking about fundamental reform as the first thing they do. Bernie Sanders made that commitment clearly at the Democracy Town Hall in New Hampshire 10 days ago. But even more exciting is when candidates like Bernie Sanders talk about giving every single voter the money they need or the vouchers they need to matter to politicians. Because look, politicians are gonna go where the money is. And if the money is with the lobbyists, that's where they're gonna go. He who pays the piper calls the tune. And we've just gotta give ordinary people the ability to be paying the piper so that they can call the tune. That's what democracy is supposed to be about.
Absolutely, and if it weren't for the work that you do, the work that Cenk Uygur does, I don't think that there would be as much pressure on politicians to reject corporate PAC money and run these clean campaigns. Dr. Lessig, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show, and it's a greater pleasure to be able to interview you for the first time.
Thanks, Hannah. It's great to be here. Thanks.
On the go? Don't worry, we got you covered. You can still listen to TYT at our new podcast network. Find us on Apple Podcasts, the Google Play Store, or at tyt.com/podcast.